As always, the Minding Your Business podcast comes to you every Friday with new episodes. I'm your host, Champ Ron, and we come sponsored by Brooks Brothers Consulting. Brooks Brothers Consulting was started by my brother Philip and I as a leadership talent development and financial institutions sales platform development organization. We started back June of 2013, and we've had an excellent opportunity to work with several community banks across many states, currently working with two financial institutions over in Louisiana right now, which I'm very excited about. But we help build sales service, operations and employee engagement platforms for financial institutions, particularly around their retail and small business banking arenas. And we also work with small business owners to help you develop your business strategy and the leadership around running a business. So listen, it's one thing to know how to make widgets. It's another thing to know the leadership and the critical thinking around how you execute strategy. And so we're your critical thinking partners, so to speak, on that. So if you need assistance in that area, I invite you to give us a call, 901-808-3801. That's 901-808-3801. That's Brooks Brothers Consulting. You can go to brooksbrothersconsulting.com. A lot of things going on. Today is Friday, October the 12th. We are at episode 65. Man, I'm excited about that. We've got the Facebook Live audience going. And today, episode 65, is part 2 of Memphis Burning. So let's get right to it.
What we do here is go back.
So yes. So good afternoon, everybody. We got our Facebook Live audience. What's going on? Lakeisha Williams, Daniel Watson says, "Don't worry about him. Let's just talk about what he said." Yeah. So we can definitely get into that. Daniel, man, if you want to do that. I'm just interacting. For those that are on the podcast, I'm interacting with the folks on Facebook Live. If you want to connect with me, there's different ways that you can do that. You can get me on Twitter at ChampRon. It's got a couple underscores in there, but at ChampRon on Twitter. Of course, on Facebook, you can connect with the Facebook page for the Minding Your Business podcast. That's just / the MYB podcast. So you can do that. You can also catch me on Instagram. Same deal at ChampRon with a few underscores in there. And I love for you to be able to do that and just connect with me. And good, bad, or ugly, I love to hear from you, love to hear thoughts, ideas. If you want to be a guest on the show, you can certainly do that as well. Just reach out to me. I love to have you promote your business and share it with the audience. Growing audience, too. We've crossed over 23,000 downloads. so far in our young life of the Minding Your Business podcast. Just a little over a year, 23,000 downloads. That's not even counting, you guys on Facebook Live, which I greatly appreciate. And we just keep doing it. Number one market. Shout out to San Francisco, California. Definitely thanks for that. And of course, my native love, which is Memphis, Tennessee. And then all the markets out here people that are listening to the podcast, sharing it, downloading it. Man, I really appreciate that love. Here's the deal. Let's get into part 2 of Memphis Burning, because again, we're going to be limited on time, and I want to be quick and effective. So if you listen to part 1, and I invite you to go and listen to part 1, whether you're on Apple Podcast or Google or Stitcher or wherever you go and get your podcast stuff and your podcast content. I want you to go and do so. But last week I had my guest Darren Ballard. Darren wasn't able to join today. He had another commitment, but we're definitely going to get him back on so we can dig into this subject and get some of his thoughts. But I'm going to tackle it a little bit solo today for part 2. So if you listen to the last podcast, Darren and I talked about the beginning history of housing inequality here in Memphis and how it began between the relationship with Black Republican Robert Church Jr. and white Democrat Boss Crump, and their relationship notoriously through the 1920s and the 1930s essentially ran the political landscape here in Memphis, and how once President Roosevelt, the 32nd president of the United States, took office, Boss Crump no longer needed Robert Church, and so as a result he turned on him because he no longer needed his support from the Republican Party. And keep in mind, at this time, they had different ideologies. The ideologies between Republican and Democrat were flipped. And so, there was a little bit different landscape than what you've got today. But nonetheless, Boss Crump turned on his companion Robert Church Jr. That led to all the way down to the burning of his home, and it led to the creation of the Memphis Housing Authority, which was used then to redline, and it was also used to prevent non-whites from living in certain areas of this particular city, and this also permeated itself in other areas of this country, as was done in different cities. And so you created an area where, people of different ethnic groups and even women from a gender standpoint were shut out of a lot of areas in this city, a lot of work opportunity, particularly with housing. And that was used to create what you see or have seen over the last several decades up until now, which is the creation of housing projects, and how middle-class areas were essentially bulldozed or torn down, and housing projects such as Foot Homes and Claiborne Homes were erected. And again, a project is what? A project, right? And so the project is to see how, if you stack people on top of each other and you remove the resources, what do? Well, of course, they react as they normally would react in any study. They become aggressive towards each other. They become complacent. They lose their values and things like that. They lose their identity. And so that's what happened, and that's what happened throughout those decades, beginning in the 30s and 40s, 50s, things like that. At the same time, you had increasing cost and increasing pricing while fairly flat income levels. And so as a result of all of that, you end up with what has aroused or erected itself to today's situation. And so Lakeisha Williams says, yes, a loss of hope. Yes, that's exactly what happened. Hope was essentially eradicated, and people began getting distracted, which brings you to the thing like it was mentioned about the rapper that went to see the president on yesterday, and things like that were used to distract people from the real issues and the real things that were going on, very creatively, in the beginning very covertly, and then it became very overt over time. And so it's interesting how that dynamic worked. So today, I want to bring you back. I want to take you from the time of when we left off. Darren and I left off with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, which there's a lot more to that than what was ever presented. A lot of people are not familiar with some of the things that went down with Dr. Martin Luther King and his assassination, and particularly why and then who. And so that'll be a podcast for a later time. But so from 1968, the time when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, you had this kind of downturn in downtown Memphis. You continued to have the legacy of Boss Crump being lived out, even though he had no heirs and no one really just stepped forth. He had a culture that he had created that was carried forth by other of his disciples over the years. And then we get to a point where we started to get, men and, actually women and then black and other ethnic group politicians, beginning with, with the Fords and kind of going on to Mayor Willie Harrington, who was the former mayor of Memphis, the first elected black mayor of Memphis in 1991. And so what you've got through to today, and then when you look at Memphis Housing Authority and things like that, was under the management control of power broker Robert Lipscomb. And Robert did some really great things, but one of the things that can be argued from Robert Lipscomb's era was that control that he had and that oversight he had of Memphis Housing Authority still allowed for people, the wealthy and the rich and those that like to believe that they have certain controls, were able to continue to do that in this city, even under Robert Lipscomb. And now you have Paul Young, who's actually a friend of this podcast, a good friend of mine. He's been on this podcast, so you need to go back and check the episode that I did from Paul Young's office. And Paul Young's doing a phenomenal job. He's got a lot on his plate, of course, but he's kind of a representation of a changing of the guard. He may not even realize that, but in the transition between him and Robert Lipscomb, actually represents what I want to really get into the meat of today. And this isn't just limited, y'all, to Memphis. This is also part of what's starting to take place in other cities around the country. And it's really tied to the business community. That's why we're talking about it here on the Minding Your Business podcast, because housing inequality led to many of the economic stagnation and economic depression that then hurts many of us when we're looking to start our business, and even in the career job market and things like that. So just the whole quality of life is affected. But Paul represents some of that changing of the guard. Coach Cleo on Facebook says Mayor Loeb. Yeah, Mayor Loeb was a disciple of the Boss Crump era. And Mayor Loeb was actually the mayor of Memphis at the time when Dr. King was assassinated. And one of the things that hurt, just real quick, because Coach Cleo brought that up. So one of the things that happened with that, when you go back and read and you study, Mayor Loeb was one of the ones, the catalyst for the further disintegration of the city of Memphis at that time, because of his reaction to the assassination and death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Other cities, for instance, in Atlanta, they did various marches. They were very supportive and things like that, whereas Mayor Loeb was very standoffish, almost being antagonistic towards it, in saying that, essentially he should have brought himself here to fight for poor people. And if he had not done that, he'd still be alive. And that's essentially, I'm paraphrasing. I'm not saying that's his exact wording, but I'm paraphrasing. So with that type of mentality from the leader of the city, in the city where he was assassinated, that didn't go over well. And that helped propel other cities. You saw Atlanta and Dallas and some other comparatively sized cities to Memphis continue on this escalation up, and Memphis remained flat at best. And the only way then, as the domino effect, was you had white flight and you had people who had already started to move north and south now moving east in the city. And the housing authority was used to prevent certain people from following certain people around, to prevent black people from following white people around east and things like that. And they even went into Mississippi. Here's what's starting to happen now, which is very interesting. You had the 2008 downturn in the economy. That caught a lot of people with their pants down, caught a lot of people. It was the great equalizer for some communities, because up until that point, around here, DeSoto County had been the largest growing county in the country. People were getting away from the city. They were antagonistic towards the city. Now they didn't mind using the city for what they need, which is their work and entertainment. But when it came to living in the city, that was different and then there's a lot of reasons for that, and not to get into all that. But if you remember from part 1 of this podcast, remember there was the lady in 1953 that basically told the mayor at that time, which I believe might have been Mayor Loeb. She was quoted as saying that if you want to survive here, you've got to move away to protect your children if you want to have good children. And that's the mantra that has carried Memphis into today. That's why the population hasn't grown, but the geography has. So Memphis is 325 square miles, larger than New York City, larger than many large metropolitan, densely populated areas. But Memphis is not densely populated because the population has not grown in the last really almost 50 years. It's been really flat. So what happened is city government here, and this is many city governments, they chased the money. And they chased the people running east. They couldn't chase the challenge Memphis had is they couldn't chase them into eastern Arkansas, and they couldn't chase them into North Mississippi. But they chased them out east. And that becomes very costly to do that, to maintain infrastructure, to maintain the means of production, management, and things like that over those areas. Becomes very difficult to do because in some cases you're having to allocate resources to very thinly populated areas, some areas with no population at all. And so that contributed to some of, again, the further downfall within the city. One of the things, and I mentioned earlier in terms of with Paul Young, and you see now as you get into today's culture, and why I say you're seeing not just limited to Memphis, but even just around, you see construction going on, you see investment and things like that. And, Paul's in a lot of that. There's different commissions. There's different organic grassroots efforts that are going all the way around. Here in Memphis, some with more fanfare than others, some more covert versus overt as others are. But you're starting to see investments in areas of Memphis. Now, here's where the challenge still lies, because in getting and kind of moving forth from that boss crump culture, there's going to have to be an investment outside of the Memphis the Poplar Walnut Grove areas. For those listening to the podcast, Poplar Avenue and Walnut Grove are some of the two major east-west arteries, transportation arteries here in the city, and both run from essentially the river, the Mississippi River, all the way out east throughout the entire Shelby County. And so it's kind of a concentration of wealth. And a lot of cities are like this. They have these areas that have concentrations of wealth. A lot of Memphis's wealth is concentrated in the Poplar Walnut Grove area. And that, to the point that you've got some people who never travel more than 2 miles north or south of those streets unless they're going to work. And then they travel downtown to go to Memphis Grizzlies games and to go to the Bass Pro and to go to restaurants and things like that. And then when they leave, they go back out east, or they go south in most cases to DeSoto County in North Mississippi. And so the next wave is going to be, how does the city make investments outside of that core where wealth is kind of concentrated? And how does it make investments in Whitehaven outside of Elvis Presley Enterprises? So how does it make investments, critical investments to connect the soul of the community? So it's not just going in and leveling things and just erecting things, just for the sake of doing it or just to get grant money. But how does it really connect to the soul? How do you add more soul into Overton Square? Overton Square has a lot of art, but it doesn't have a lot of soul, right? And in the past, these areas had a lot of soul. So we got a lot of art. There's a lot of artsy things that are going on and creatives. But you've got to go back into these areas and add the soul. And this is my opinion. So someone may disagree. Lakeisha says, now Memphis is over-annexed, the belt of wealth. Yeah. And so you're starting to see, in some cases, some de-annexation because the city's realizing that it cannot continue. It's just like, think personally for yourself. It's the same thing. Can you increase your expenses at home without increasing your income? Can you increase the size of your house, right? And you don't add more people, but you just keep adding on to your house. Well, at some point, you're going to have to go, even if you're not going to a bathroom, right? You're still going to have to go and clean it up at some point. And someone's going to demand that you go clean it up because otherwise you can still get issues. So if you keep adding on to your house, right? So you go from 2,000 square feet to 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000, but it's the same 2 or 3 people living in it. You're still got utilities going to it. You're having to add another HVAC. You've got all these expenses that still come up. That's the same analogy I give for what happened to the city of Memphis. They just kept chasing, people, and they just kept building onto the house. And so Lakeisha's right. There's an over-annexation, but there's got to be an investment in these areas and these communities. But Paul represents, in my opinion, and then you saw what happened with the elections this year, where you had many new faces to politics. And I don't even want to get into all the names because I know I'm going to leave some of them out and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, you had you have this newness that's coming about. Now, some of it from a political standpoint, some of that was driven by a few different factors. Well, one, some people are having a hard time defending the White House right now. And and not just the White House, but the entire executive branch of government. People are having trouble with them, the legislative branch and the judicial branch in some cases, as you saw with Kavanaugh. People are having a hard time defending that. And the tweets that come out of the executive branch. And you had strong grassroots efforts by some folks, particularly here in Memphis. So folks that got in the races early, they allowed themselves to not be distracted. They had strong teams behind them, and now they're in the game. And it's going to be incumbent that we support the new progressives that are coming in. And when we say that, and then we match that with when we go into that voting booth, and that's been the challenge for many years, is we're often as Americans, we're not good at voting in our best interest. We vote for things that we get hung up on that someone tells us we should care about instead of our own best interests. And fear tactics are used to then say, well, this group of people is doing this or that group of people is doing that. And in a lot of cases, that's just not true. It's just not accurate in fact. But it's easy to play on the masses' fears, right? And so now, again, when we're going to this new culture, you're starting to see people in their transparency saying, look, I don't have to just go for the guy just because I know his name. So I'm not just always selecting, the devil that I know versus the one that I think I don't know. So it's not that mentality. Again, that old culture is slowly dying off. And in some areas, it died off quickly, right? Very progressive areas. Memphis, it may be a little slower, but we're going to get there. And what we've got to look to do is support these new progressives that are coming in. It's not always about just them being younger, while that plays a big part. you can be more seasoned and have a new, different approach and a fresh approach to how we work in the community and how we edify and then edify the business community, right? So I encourage everybody as we're listening to this episode and we look today at all the different projects that are happening in different areas, mostly downtown, a lot in Midtown, things like that. But even, east of Highland, there hasn't been a ton of new innovation or new projects, even east of Highland. And, around the airport, around all these different areas. Stephen Fowler, what's going on? How you doing? Jerry Eccles, just shouting out. Ray Williams, what's going on? Family right there. Thank y'all for joining in and listening to the podcast, man. But these things you got to be doing. You got to go into these areas now. And hopefully, as we support these younger progressives in terms of their mindset, that we make sure that they understand this history, right? And that's why we're going through this with this particular podcast, because people have to understand the deep, rich culture that comes when housing is used as a form to create overt and even covert inequality. And as we develop these areas and we hold people accountable to developing certain areas, that's where you go see Memphis really take off. Memphis is great geographically. Memphis is very solid when you look at the status of Fortune 500 companies that are headquartered here. Memphis has phenomenal people of all walks of life. They're phenomenal people that live here in Memphis, man. I mean, some of the best, most supportive people live right here in Memphis, Tennessee. No doubt about it. I put it up against it. I've lived in other places. Like I've shared on this podcast, I've lived in D.C. I've lived in Seattle, Washington. I was originally born in Chicago. I was very young there. But there's no place like Memphis, man. None at all. None at all. So I would, encourage people, man, as you're looking to invest in Memphis, right? And you are supportive of these new progressives and things like that. Hold them accountable so that doesn't go away. They've got to be held accountable to what their platform is and things like that. And we all that are not in politics and things like that, we've got to be then supportive of outside the accountability. Lend your helping hand, lend your listening ear, lend your resources. And share your resources and your knowledge, your networks, your things like that to help the city continue to progress, because that's what's going to allow for many of us that are in business or starting business or been in business for some time to have the opportunities to grow and continue to scale. Because we still have, although there's been a lot of great work with the Office of Business and Diversity. So I shout out Joanne Massey, great family right there. And she's just phenomenal, her entire team. They're doing great things. And, it's been a short period of time. It takes time to get these things to move. But we've got to be supportive of those kind of efforts. And, we've got to get receipts for, all businesses and small businesses up that are doing business with the city. And I know that's what Joanne and her team are doing really aggressively. And we've got to continue to do that and help, businesses be able to scale to the point that they're hiring people and also creating other industry and supporting each other in business. And so like a FedEx begins as a small business, and now look how many companies are connected and tied to as vendors to FedEx. They created a whole industry. They were a disruptor. And we've got to get more of that. Right now, we've got a lot of onesie and twosie type businesses where a lot of us are, we got an EIN number and a smile. And we got to do more than just have an EIN number and a business license and a website and a social media page, right? We've got to get to where we're generating opportunities and creating platforms for each other, all the way around for ourselves and each other. And so I hope that going through this particular history, hopefully it was helpful and people were able to learn. Now, my guy, Daniel Watson, shout out, man, White Station guy, alum, so we forgive him for that. White Station High School, great high school here in Memphis, Tennessee. Some folks wanted to tie this to, and I'll go ahead and say it, although it hurts me a little bit to say because I hate perpetuating the foolishness. But so rapper Kanye West goes to the White House with former NFL great and Hall of Famer Jim Brown, I believe, was there. I'm not sure who else. There's some other folk there, but anyway, they went to meet with Donald Trump. The idea was for them to talk about killings in Chicago, which is Kanye West hometown. So his hometown is in Chicago, Illinois, and he was, from what I understand, going there to speak about some things that President Donald Trump can help facilitate from his role to help mitigate some of that. And Kanye was quoted, and there's a video of him with his "Make America Great Again" hat, red hat on, and hugging the president and telling him how much he loves him and that sort of thing, and saying that him wearing the hat makes him feel like Superman. So I said, okay. So, I've left that alone, and I know that's been buzzing, and it's hard to get. I understand. I had this conversation on social media because I didn't want to use his name because I didn't want to be another person perpetuating that type of message and that type of visual, because that's what Kanye really is looking for. He's, you remember, let me relate it to this. You remember in school, right? So when you're in elementary school, the class clown feeds off the energy of what? Your attention. It's just the class clown and a professional comedian are very similar. And I've given this analogy several times on several different things, and y'all know this. So a comedian has to make a choice. So if a comedian's up on stage and telling jokes and nobody's laughing, he or she's going to have to make a decision real quick, right? He's got to abort mission, continue to tell the jokes and have nobody say anything, or find a new career at some point, right? I mean, that's what you got to do. The class clown in class is doing stuff to get a reaction. Okay? He or she wants to get a reaction out of what? The mass audience. Class clown, they're not, as long as they're getting the attention, that's what they care about. It's not about whether you like them, what you think about their platform, what you think about what they're doing, as long as you're paying them attention, right? Doesn't matter if you're mad, doesn't matter if you're happy, if you laugh, you think it's hilarious, whatever it is, as long as they're getting the attention, that's what they're seeking. Their biggest fear, the biggest fear of the class clown is nobody gives a damn, right? Nobody cares. That's the biggest thing that they worry about. Because if they do something, if they throw a spitball and people are like, nobody looks, nobody laughs, they make a face, right? You think a kindergarten kid. They look, they make a face, nobody laughs, nobody pays them any attention, they move on to the next thing. That kills someone who loves attention. That kills them. Because now they're trying to figure out, well, what did I do wrong? Nobody reacted. That's the same thing Kanye, even though Kanye's 40 years old, he's playing the role of class clown right now. Okay? And the masses, he knows, just like the media knows, that they can promote him and that everybody's going to react. Nobody was worried about the hurricane when Kanye West, nobody was worried about Kavanaugh anymore. Nobody was worried about any of these election things. It distracted everybody, right? And the reason it did was Kanye's such an attention grabber that that was it. You know what I mean? That was it. And so one of the things that I hope that we can gather from that particular situation is you can't give that all that attention. But based on what he said, I don't really care. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a follower, not a fan, none of that. Yeah, it's a guy that he's made good music in the past and things like that, popular music. but it gives the wrong message, particularly when and I've got nothing against the president. Any president has had concerns, at least from my standpoint, whether it's historical, whether it's President Trump, whether it's President Obama, whether it's President Bush, Clinton, Reagan, Nixon, go all the way back, Carter, Ford, Roosevelt, Eisenhower. Pick one, and you can pick out flaws, and you can pick out things that they do that has been really solid. But what the concern with Kanye is that just the act and the class clown nature of what he's doing is not really necessary, because then it's being used to distract people from real issues. And that's what happens, is particularly in America, the greatest science project in the world. People are easily distracted with celebrity and entertainment and sports, and things like that. And you're talking about a guy that played sports for some time too. So, but all those things are used to distract people. And like I said, I'll go back to it. You notice that unless you were in Florida, Georgia, or South Carolina, you lost track of the hurricane coming through, right? That hit shore as a Category 4, almost a Category 5, and moved slow, and didn't really lose a ton of power right at first. Nobody cared, right? Because everybody's worried about what Kanye West got to say. And this is one of those countries that's like that. If you travel to other countries, their media is different. Now, again, when you don't have a democracy, that makes a difference too, or so-called democracy. But so anyway, that's kind of my take on Kanye West as people were inquiring about Mr. West. So. Oh, man, it looks like some people, I might have lost some people on the Facebook Live. But anyway, nonetheless, if you're listening here to the podcast, you'll be able to pick up the recording. So sometimes that happens with our technology. So it looks like I might have lost some folks on the Facebook Live. But anyway, enough about Mr. West. Memphis Burning Part 2. Hope that if you listen to Part 1 and you listen here to Part 2, that you are able to get something that you can take with you, learn from. If you want to connect with me again, you can email me, ron@themybpodcast.com. That's ron@themybpodcast.com. And you can email me. Good, bad, ugly. If you got questions, you agree, you disagree. I love to be able to have a dialogue. If you're interested in being a guest and showcasing your business, showcasing your next event, sharing what you're working on, that sort of thing, I'd love to have you. I've had guests, as you know, from all over the world and all over the country. That's the beauty, again, of technology. So I'd love to be able to have you on. So subscribe to this on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, all the different platforms, YouTube. Share this, and let's continue to grow. Let's continue to be great. I'm your host, Champ Ron. This is the Minding Your Business podcast, and we're going to sign off for today. We'll be back on next week with more information, entrepreneurship, real estate, trending news topics, the best practices around it. There's no business like minding your own. Y'all have a great weekend. Enjoy it with friends and family. And we'll be back next week.